really don't think it has to. I think we can beat that myth. Yes.
What's the name of chapter 6?
Peking squirrel? I have no idea what the name of chapter 6 is. It might be energy and... I don't know. I have no idea. Do you have your book?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Because I want to look at it for something that I wrote on a post-it note, which I left in my office.
Do you want it right now?
Not yet.
Okay.
There'll be a time. All right, so in this chapter, we're thinking about energy in a more general sense. We're going to think about some of the terms associated with energy, and then when we jump into the metabolism chapter for aerobic respiration, we'll have the groundwork, and I think you will find that you can beat that topic, and I hope you do. All right, so first of all, let's think about energy and the forms of energy. And actually, before we think about the forms of energy, let's think about the whole concept of thermodynamics, which has, if you have had biology or chemistry or physics before, you know there are two major laws of thermodynamics. And thermodynamics as a word means change, right? So dynamic means to change. This is a word that has sort of different meanings depending on the context. If you're in a science class versus if you're just out, you might say that person has a really dynamic personality. But in science, when we say dynamic, we mean that something is changing, okay? And that's a contrast to static. So in this case, thermodynamics means change in heat, but heat in this case insinuates the presence of energy. So this is about changes in energy. So first of all, let's think about the two laws of thermodynamics. Some of these are a little hard to stomach, I think, but they are true. The first law is that energy is neither created nor destroyed. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, but can be transferred or changed in form. It's neither created nor destroyed, but it can be transferred and it can change forms. All right, the second law I think of the most concise way to say this. A change in form or the transfer of energy results in an increase in entropy. Okay, a change in form or the transfer of energy results in an increase in entropy. And entropy, over here, entropy is the measure of disorder in a system. Okay, so let's think about these for just a second. The energy is neither created nor destroyed, but can be transferred or changed in form. So metabolism, breaking down organic molecules to make ATP, utilizing that ATP to do work, we are changing forms of energy. Now it does seem to me, it has always seemed like energy disappears. But the energy actually isn't disappearing, it's changing form. So one way that the energy changes form or is transferred is in the production of heat. So that's a great, back door to explain where did all the energy go. It's not that, we are not that efficient. So a lot of times as we break organic molecules down and we utilize that energy, some of that energy is lost in the form of heat, but it's just lost to us, right? That heat may do work elsewhere. So it's not created or destroyed, it's just changing form. And the idea that the change in form or the transfer of energy resulting in an increase in entropy, which means we have more disorder after energy changes form, means that the organization, well, in the case of the biology and chemical systems we're going to look at, the organization of a molecule is best or highest before it's broken down. So for example, if you had a long chain fatty acid like a lipid, like you're storing energy in fats, as you break off those carbons along that long fatty acid tail, you're releasing energy. But every time you break off a carbon, you go from one fatty acid molecule to a fatty acid plus a carbon, plus 2 carbons, plus 3 carbons, plus 4 carbons. So the order of that system is diminishing as you harvest energy from it. Okay, so as you break things down, they increase in disorder. There's a picture that I always wish the book, I like to put this up mostly to make fun of it, because I wish the book had just shown a real molecule breaking down instead of a purple orb of crystals bursting like the Death Star. Why not just use a real example? In any case, we'll see some real examples. Okay, so with that in place, let's briefly hydrate some pink water. And let's talk about the forms that energy might come in. Red Bull, soda, sugar water. Don't write this down. You're not writing this down, sure. Those are not forms of energy. They're forms of toxins.
I don't know, I quite like that list.
What?
I like that list.
I didn't say we don't have our vices. First form of energy, which Red Bull can lead to, is kinetic energy. Kinetic energy is the energy of what? You probably know this, but
Motion.
motion, the energy of motion or movement. Okay, so this is a pretty straightforward one to think of examples for. They've got swinging the bat. A bowling ball rolling down a bowling lane is a tremendous example of kinetic energy. When that thing hits the pins, anything that is moving that can do work has kinetic energy. The second one is a little more refined, or a little more, requires a little more thought, and that is potential energy. And potential energy, as the name implies, is like something can happen but hasn't yet, right? Something has potential. Like all of you have tremendous potential, even though you don't know what you're gonna end up doing yet, but you have tremendous potential. So potential energy in the chemical sense is the energy, bless you. There was the release of potential energy, converted into the kinetic energy. So the energy of position or structure. Okay, the energy of position or structure. And one simple example of this would be like pulling a bow back, right? So there's kinetic energy used to pull the bowstring back, but if she just waits there for a minute, there's tremendous potential. Once that's released, energy will change forms and work will be done. But at this point, it's just potential. Another good example of potential energy would be like an automobile parked on a hill, right? If you were to release the brake, that automobile would start generating kinetic energy. But as it sits there, just waiting, all of that weight on an incline, that's potential energy. Now, those things don't really factor into our discussion of organic molecules of metabolism, but potential energy has a subcategory, which is chemical energy. Okay, and chemical energy is the energy stored Energy stored in chemical bonds. So an example of this would be a glucose molecule. That's the one we're going to focus on a lot this semester, how glucose is broken down to release energy and do work. And so the covalent bonds between the carbons and the oxygens and the hydrogens in glucose, as they are broken down during your metabolic process, that energy is converted into something that can do work. Okay, but if we're just looking at glucose not doing anything, not being broken down, not being used, it stores potential energy, right? There's no energy of motion there. It's just potential energy based on its structure. So we won't think about things like the bow or a parked car or a boulder rolling down a hill or anything like that. But we will be thinking about potential energy in terms of chemical bonds. Okay, let's keep moving. Here's some examples. Let's look at this little chart for a minute, just for fun. Light energy, of course, photosynthesis. That'll be the chapter after we talk about metabolism. So we'll talk about using energy and producing energy from organic molecules, and then we'll talk about how did those organic molecules get made in the first place. You can thank the sun for that. Heat energy, the transfer of kinetic energy from one object to another. Of course, we, like other warm-blooded organisms, maintain our bodies at a constant temperature. This, of course, is not universal among living organisms. A lot of organisms just go with whatever temperature is in their environment, but we are constantly generating this heat so that we maintain ourselves at 37 degrees Celsius or 98 degrees Fahrenheit. Mechanical energy, of course, is straightforward movement. Chemical energy, covalent bonds and organic molecules. And then electrical ion gradient. This is when, like in secondary active transport, for example, we produce proton gradients that do work. The work that proton gradients are going to do when we talk about cellular respiration is making ATP. Okay? All right. Purple crystal ball. Okay, let's meet the molecule of the semester, ATP. Make some space. One of my favorite examples of potential energy converting to kinetic energy was 10 years ago when I was shopping at Walmart, as one does on a Saturday morning, and my daughter called to tell me that our car had been stolen, which I thought was uncommon. You know, people don't steal a lot of cars anymore. It's not really a thing as much as it used to be. So I thought, well, surely nobody stole your car, honey. And she said, Dad, the car is gone. She'd slept over at a friend's house and she woke up and went outside to come home. The car was gone. And the reason it was gone is that the potential energy in our little stick shift Volkswagen had converted to kinetic energy because she either forgot to put on the parking brake or didn't put it on hard enough. The car rolled into the street, blocking the street. Someone called the police. The police knocked on the window, but the two sleeping girls didn't wake up, and so they towed her car. Oh, the policeman was very nice. I thought, well, why didn't you just tell her to move it? He said, we couldn't get anyone to wake up. $80 later, we got the car back. But the good news is nobody stole it. Okay. Potential energy converted to kinetic. Converted to money. All right, so let's look at this ATP molecule for a second. ATP is one of the nucleotides that has multiple purposes in the cell. So when we talk about DNA and RNA, we talk about 4 bases, right? So DNA has A, C, T, and G. RNA has A, C, U, and G. The A nucleotide in RNA is that. Okay, so this is both the nucleotide that is part of your messenger RNA and your ribosomal RNAs and all the different RNAs that you make. It's also doing dual purposes in the cell, which is to provide energy in addition to being the part of that transfer of information from your DNA to the proteins. So this is one of the primary energy molecules. It's not the only one. So there's also GTP, right, which is another RNA nucleotide that has a slightly different, although still a double ring base, but a slightly different base. That is also often used for energy in the cell. But ATP, I think, surely by a large margin, is the primary energy molecule. So we'll focus on that in this course. The reason ATP has energy is because of these three phosphate groups. Okay, so remember, a phosphate is a phosphorus surrounded by 4 oxygens. Okay, and usually that phosphorus surrounded by 4 oxygens has 2 charges if it just existed alone. We just had this little guy there. And the phosphorus, when it's attached, phosphate, when it's attached to 2 other phosphates, has sort of an uneasy relationship in these covalent bonds. Okay, phosphates have a unique way of sharing some of that electron energy and electron presence among themselves. So instead of these electrons and the electron charges being isolated at the ends of these oxygens, they're kind of sharing them to a strange degree that other molecules can't. And the reason this is important is that when you have all those negative charges together, you'd think they would just all pop apart and disperse from each other, but they've come to an arrangement. Okay, it's like 3 siblings who decide it's best not to fight, let's just get along. And when they do, that tremendous amount of energy is ready to be used, but is not sort of destroying the molecule. So because the phosphate is ready to pop off and release energy, adding water to the equation, remember, hydrolysis means splitting in the presence of water. So if we hydrolyze this organic molecule, one of those phosphates can come off. Now the other phosphate can come off too. It doesn't happen that commonly when you're transferring energy from ATP in an enzymatic reaction, but if you're making a messenger RNA molecule, for example, 2 of the 3 phosphates come off. So we'll talk about that down the road. But the point is, these guys have a tremendous amount of energy to give. And that energy comes in the form of kilocalories. All right, so a kilocalorie is a measure of energy. We'll talk about every now and then. And that measure of energy it has to be related to some amount, right? If we just said, this gasoline will do work, well, you won't know how much work until you know how much gasoline you're dealing with. So the work that this does, the 7.3 kilocalories, is per mole of ATP, right? And we could measure the, how much ATP would require to be a mole, but we don't need to do that calculation. The point is, we have a number that we can use to compare to other molecules, and that is negative 7.3 kilocalories per mole. Now the negative here is a good thing, and we'll get to that here in a second. Okay, so thinking about that ATP releasing the phosphate. So here's a more simplified diagram where they took off most of the names of the atoms, and we just see ATP, which is the triphosphate, in the presence of water, undergoes hydrolysis, which releases that phosphate. If we want to make ATP again and add that phosphate back, we have to put energy in, right? We can't get something for nothing. So in order to make ATP, we add energy. In order to harvest energy, we break ATP down. So there are a few things that we want to think about here. Oops. We want to put our chemical reactions in a category based on whether they are requiring or releasing energy. Okay, so I'm going to abbreviate reactions there if you're wondering what that word is. So the types of reactions that we're going to think about in this chapter and beyond. The first one is endergonic. Okay, and an endergonic reaction implies, if we know nothing else about it, it implies that energy is required for that reaction to take place. Okay, so an endergonic reaction requires energy to proceed. Okay, so examples of endergonic reactions, I'll put in parentheses below it. Simply gratis, e.g., synthesis, ATP. I'll put the heavy hitters that we're going to be talking about a lot. Synthesis of ATP, glucose, proteins, etc. So if we're making something, if we're building an organic molecule, usually that is an energy-intensive process. On the other hand, the other side of the proverbial coin, we we have exergonic reactions. Exergonic reactions release energy as they take place. So we'll say releases energy as they proceed. And there are many examples of this, but the primary one that we want to think about is actually let's not say breakdown, let's say hydrolysis. I want that term to become very familiar to you. So hydrolysis of ATP. Let's just keep it at that. Let's keep it simple. Hydrolysis of ATP. Okay, so inorganic and exergonic reactions are characterized by the input or the release of energy, but they're also characterized by, there's a numerical association with that, which is, well, let me just put it and then we'll come back in a second. So exergonic reactions are intergonic. Let's start with that. Intergonic reactions have a positive free energy. And free energy is a term that is associated with actually, I want to put one more word in, sorry. Have positive change in free energy. Okay, and that is associated with the expression delta G. All right, so delta, what does delta usually mean when we see it in front of a letter or in front of something else? Change, right? Delta is usually referring to a change. And in association with delta G, the G actually stands for, I believe it's the name of the biochemist who first described or characterized this scenario. It's called Gibbs free energy. I don't know if chemists usually throw that word around much. I always just say delta G. I rarely say Gibbs, but that's where the G comes from, if you're wondering. So, the change in free energy, a delta G, can be positive or negative, right? If we're changing, we can go up or we can go down. So a change that's positive is associated with intergonic reactions. Okay? An exergonic reaction is going to have a negative change in free energy. So that will be negative delta G. So again, if we don't know anything else about the reaction, if you don't even know what's in the reaction, but somebody said this reaction has a negative delta G, you would know it's an intergonic, or sorry, you wouldn't know that. You would know it's an exergonic reaction, and you know that energy was released in the process of that reaction taking place. Okay, now this part, well actually, let me see how I want to say this. Yes, can I use your book now? Please. I'll turn the elephant back around. He doesn't have the long memory that most elephants have. What the chances I can find this chapter 6? Oh, there's the title. Introduction to Energy, Enzymes, and Metabolism. Picture of the boy thinking about stealing some drugs from the store. Okay, so on page, let's see. All right, so in the book, the version that you get from the bookstore, this is on page 148. You want to look at that later? Erase this. So the concept of this is coupled reactions. I wanted to make sure I got my numbers right. Probably would get close from memory, but I didn't want to make a mistake. No reason to be wrong. So the idea of a coupled reaction is this. If you have a exergonic reaction, then that reaction is going to take place, right? Actually, now that I think about that, let's associate another word with a negative delta G, and that is the reaction is spontaneous. So that's a term that you hear often regarding chemical reactions. They can be spontaneous, which means they take place. Okay, so if a reaction is spontaneous, that's fine. You don't have to do anything, to make that happen because it is already exergonic. But if a reaction is endergonic and you want that to take place, you can combine an exergonic and an endergonic reaction, two different reactions. And if there's more negative free energy than positive free energy, the energy from one reaction can drive the process of another. Okay, so it's almost like the endergonic reaction is feeding off the energy of the exergonic reaction. Now, you can't just take any two reactions that have different energies and combine them. But biologically, sometimes these reactions take place because an enzyme, like hexokinase in this case, pulls these two things together and uses the energy released from one to drive the reaction for the other. Okay, so these things are engineered by our cells. They're not just happening to happen. Okay, you can't just take any two reactions. So the reaction that I wanted to emphasize is the one that they have in your book, which is, let me write it out as I talk about it. We have glucose and we have phosphate. I'm going to abbreviate phosphate instead of writing the word out. We have glucose and phosphate, and we want to produce the molecule glucose 6-phosphate. Okay? In the process of producing glucose 6-phosphate, like many processes where we add one organic molecule to another, water will be made in the process. So we have water as our little extra friend there. Okay? Now this is not a very endergonic or exergonic reaction. So the delta G, I'll put it to the left here. Usually you write it to the right, but we're out of room. The delta G is positive 3.3 kilocalories per mole. So knowing nothing else about this, if you knew it was positive 3.3, do you think this reaction is endergonic or exergonic? Endergonic, right? It's not spontaneous. It has a positive delta G. So energy is going to be required to make this happen. Okay. Now the second reaction is the other one we've been talking about, ATP. And they went ahead and put the charge in the book, so I'll do that too. ATP plus water breaking down to ADP, which still has two negative charges, right? And then the other two negative charges went with the phosphate. Okay, now this reaction we've already seen a few times in our slides. This one wants to happen, right? The whole point of ATP is to release energy when one of those phosphates gets lobbed off. And so that delta G is going to be negative, and I think it's negative 7.3. Yeah, 7.3 kilocalories per mole. So we know that's exergonic, right? That's the theme of the day. But if we were able to couple these reactions, okay, if we were able to somehow take advantage of the fact that ATP wants to give a phosphate away and glucose wants to take that phosphate, and energy is working out in favor of the ATP over the positive delta G, bless you. If we couple those reactions, then we have glucose plus ATP resulting in glucose 6-phosphate, and the 6 there doesn't mean 6-phosphate, so maybe I should have said something about that. The 6 refers to the position on the ring, which is the glucose sugar ring. It refers to the position where the phosphate is added, so the 6th carbon. It's not 6 phosphates. So this results in then glucose 6-phosphate plus ADP, whoops. And then we still end up with our water, I believe, although they don't show it there. Well, that's okay, won't worry about that. So the delta G of this is easy to calculate. This is maybe one of the easiest calculations that we can do in chemistry and biology. All we're doing is adding them. Just add them together and ask, is it positive or negative? Right, so if we add negative 7.3 and positive 3.3, we still are negative. But in this case, negative is good. It's one example where we want to be negative. Thank you very much. Right, so this is the concept of the coupled reaction, that if you have a reaction that's likely to go, and somehow it can be incorporated into a reaction that needs energy, the combination of those two is a net win, all right? And this is where the role of the enzyme comes in, because without an enzyme, glucose and ATP might have never found each other. But one of the ways that enzymes facilitate reactions, they're not doing anything magic. They're just putting two things that are able to react close enough to have that interaction, okay? Let's see. All right, so this can be diagrammed on a graph, and whenever we see a graph, we know that we're looking at future test questions. Right? Just too easy whenever you see a graph to utilize that in an exam to see if you understand the concept. All right, and the role of a graph, even though it feels sinister, especially on this treacherous week of the first lab exam. Has anyone had it already? Oh, that's it? Just a few of you. You're still alive. How was it?
Not fun.
Oh, fully down. Okay, not even a, there's a little bit of optimism, a little bit of hope. Oh man, and how many left to take it? Well, just remember, they said it was awesome. You're gonna do great. I think it's called gaslighting. Well, I hope you do well. I hope you do well. Don't panic on the microscope. All right, so what does this graph mean? Oh, I know where I was headed with all that. I was headed in the direction of telling you, remember, graphs are meant to help you. Try to remember that. The point of a graph is to make a concept easier, not harder, even though sometimes it takes a minute to get your head wrapped around it. Okay, so in this graph, we have two axes, like every graph, I guess. The progress of the reaction on the bottom and the change in free energy on the left. The vertical axis is a change, so if we go up, that's a positive change. If we go down on the vertical axis, that's a negative change, right? If we are progressing with our exergonic reaction, that means, like any chemical reaction, we start with reactants, we end with products, right? And in between, there's some activity, and a reaction, some chemical reactions, not all chemical reactions, have to go through this little bump in the road at the beginning before they coast down to the products. So this is the release of my daughter's parking brake and the coasting of the car into the intersection. So that little bump in the road is called the activation energy, okay? And so the activation energy for a given enzyme, or a given reaction, I should say, can vary. Let's write a couple things out here. So we start with our reactants over here. And to get to the end of this reaction, we've got to go over that bump, and then we coast down, and finally the products have a certain, let me make that a little higher. Sorry. Products are going to end up down here, so we have two positions on our vertical axis. We have our starting energy, and we have our final energy. So the energy of the reactants and the energy of the products. So if we start here, let me just use A or R and P instead of A and B. So if we start with our reactants and we end with our products, is that change positive or negative? Negative. Brilliant future in chemistry for all of you. So a negative delta G. Now this doesn't have any numbers in it, so we don't have to worry about the calculation. This is just conceptualizing high to low. Now this may seem counterintuitive because we see this big bump at the beginning, so it may not look like it's a negative change, but we're asking start to finish, where are we at? Start to finish, it's negative delta G. So getting over this bump is going to be an issue. So this is called the activation energy, or the energy of activation. Some people call it that, but it's a little awkward. And that is abbreviated E subscript capital A. So without an enzyme, this reaction may never happen. Even though technically it's exergonic, it may never happen without the influence of an enzyme. And an enzyme is the catalyst, but in this case, a different way to think of it is the enzyme is the thing that's bringing the glucose and the ATP together. So we know on paper, the combination of those two things comes out negative. But in the cell, that's only true if they find each other. And the enzyme is what helps them find each other. So this is without the enzyme. And if we add the enzyme, now the two molecules, in this case, actually the next picture has it in there. The ATP and the glucose find each other because the enzyme grabs onto one, and then it grabs onto the other, and it puts them together. And it smooths out that hump in the road. Okay, so this little sub component, this is the energy of activation with the enzyme. Okay, so we can say, and be accurate, that enzymes lower activation energy for reactions. We could also say that enzymes are the catalyst that couples reactions together to come out with a negative delta G. All right, so again, the measure of that change in free energy is just the starting to the end. It doesn't include any nuances from the activation energy. Now, a second concept to introduce at this time would be the idea of enzymes changing form, or changing the form of, well, no, it's awkward. Let me just delete that last phrase. Let's just look at the slide and I'll explain what I'm trying to say. Enzymes exist first without their substrates. Actually, I don't even know if we've used the word, have we used the word substrate before? Maybe not. We need to talk about what that is. So let's back up just a second. So an enzyme is a protein or RNA catalyst for biological chemical reactions. It's rarely an RNA, but I want to be accurate and not exclude that, because one of the biggest things that happens in your cell, even though there aren't many examples of RNA catalysts, one of the biggest things that happens is catalyzed by RNA, and that's protein synthesis. Can you see that over on the right side? I realize now I'm writing in this, behind the shadows. All right, I'm going to make a line so I don't go over into that space anymore. Sorry about that. No self-awareness. Okay, so here's our enzyme without the substrate. So the substrate, or a substrate, is the reactant in an enzyme catalyzed reaction. This is the thing the enzyme uses to eventually create a product. So that means that the enzyme can be interacting with the substrate. It's not always interacting with the substrate, but when it does, it can form an enzyme substrate complex. So that enzyme substrate complex is a transient state. Okay, it doesn't last long, But in the enzyme substrate complex, that's when the enzyme is going to take the reactant and produce a product. Okay, in this case, the reactant we'll call the substrate. So in that spot, that phosphate is attached to the glucose, right? So the phosphate is the little yellow ball, the glucose is the blue hexagon, and when it pops over there, then the products can be released and the enzyme goes back to its original state. All right? And sometimes people use a term, well, two terms. Here's our conformational change. We talked about that. So the binding of the substrate causes the enzyme to change a little. And another term that I don't use this term very much, but you may hear it elsewhere, so it's important to introduce it, I guess. People call it an induced fit, meaning that the way I think about it, this may be a stupid analogy, but the way I think about it is like when you're putting on a boot, it's hard to get a boot on if it's a good fitting boot. And so you have to squeeze your foot in there, but then once it's in there, it's perfect, right? And so you have to induce the fit. Probably a stupid analogy, but in my mind, I always think about how hard it is to get on boots, but then how glad I am once it's on. So the induced fit means that the molecules, the substrates, as they bind, cause this conformational change, and now those two chemicals who might have never met each other out in the cytosol now are going to have a chance to interact. And because that phosphate is dying to pop off that ATP, because that glucose is dying to get that phosphate, magic. It's a Valentine's Day miracle. Okay, a couple more things and then we're around the corner into the end of today's lecture. And move back over here. Another graph. Another Valentine's week miracle. Okay, the way to think about how effective enzymes are relative to their substrate concentration is a graph where you measure the amount of product that's being made as a function of the amount of substrate. So when we say velocity over here, this is a term that you might not associate with enzymes or biology, but velocity means the amount, in this context, the amount of product that's made per second. So some enzymes or some chemical reactions work slow enough that you can actually measure these things pretty easily. Some enzymes work so fast, this measurement becomes really technically difficult. But let's assume that this one could be measured. And so over the course of time, in this case, 60 seconds, the amount of product that's made per second rises as you add more substrate, right? So substrate concentration is increasing as we go left to right. As substrate concentration increases, so does velocity, but only to a point, right? Up here we have what's called the Vmax. The Vmax in this case, let's define a couple terms over here. So the Vmax is it stands for maximum velocity. What that means is that velocity can no longer increase even with more, or higher, not more, even with higher substrate concentration. Velocity can no longer increase even if we increase the substrate. So what does that mean? If you are an enzyme, well, let's say that we have, let's just draw a couple enzymes here, maybe 3. Let's make it prime. Actually, 2 is also prime. So if we have 3 enzymes, and these 3 enzymes have their active sites, and our substrate is here, how many substrates can be processed at the same time by these 3 enzymes? This is not a trick. I'm not leading you down into a trap. We have 3 enzymes. How many substrates can we process? 3. Yeah, so not a trap. So this substrate could be processed by that, this one by that, this one by that. Okay, so in this moment, if we added a fourth substrate, could it be processed? No, right? Let's think of this in terms we're more familiar with. There are 3 people at Wendy's taking orders at the front of the kitchen. If there are 3 customers and there is a line of 20 people because the school bus just dropped off a bunch of middle schoolers, only 3 people are going to get service at that moment, no matter how many people are in the line. So if we only had 2 people, if we increased the substrate concentration, now the amount of product is going to increase. If we add another one, the amount of product is going to increase. If we add another one, for any given moment, it's not going to get any higher, right? It doesn't matter how much more we add, there are still just 3 people taking orders. So in the case of our graph, if we add more substrate and we have enzymes that can service that substrate, we're going to get more product. Now, as those enzymes are getting tapped out because they're doing as much as they can, but they only have so many, eventually you'll get to the point where no amount of extra substrate will result in any additional product because everything is working as fast as it can. And so one way that we can think of this process is to say that the enzymes, bless you, are saturated. Bless you. Okay, all the active sites are taken. And so you can add and add and add and get more and more and more, but only to a point. And I won't use this calculation, but if you do, I'm sure in chemistry they'll talk about Km, which is the amount of substrate when you're at halfway to your full velocity. So that's what the Km is. I won't ask you that. I do want you to understand that I did the Vmax, since we spent 5 minutes talking about it. But that's what happens. So you keep adding more and more, and you increase to a point, but then you reach this saturation where all of the enzymes are being used, all of the active sites are taken. So no matter how much more you add, you're still going as fast as you can. Okay, I don't think I want to talk about inhibitors because I just have a few minutes, and this is a 2-part section that I want to elaborate on. So